بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. يا ربنا زدنا علما وتقوى وبارك في أوقاتنا وفي أقوالنا وفي أفاعلنا وتقبل منا ولا تأخذنا بذنوبنا. أنت مولانا فنستعين عليك ونتوجه إليك ونتوب إليك ونصلي ونسلم على الذي أرسلته بالهدى ودين الحق ليعلم الناس طريقة الرشد. We wanted to begin with a brief conversation on the issue of ibtila or adversity. A lot of times we hear the statement inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un, and most of the time is used with regard to a death that may occur. But the reality is that the Quran describes this statement to say that indeed from Allah we come and to Allah we return is a statement that's made when we're struck with adversity. When we're struck with adversity. And the most interesting thing is that the context in which this statement is made in Surah Al-Baqarah, in which Allah wa Ta'ala describes those who are struck with adversity as those who say, when they're struck with adversity, they should say that indeed from Allah we come and to Allah we return. And in that there's a recognition of our origin and there's a recognition of the order that dominates in the world. The world is full of flux and change, but Allah wa Ta'ala remains the same. And in that context, we see the real meaning of La ilaha illallah, that there is no God worthy of worship other than Allah, than the Creator. Because the Creator remains the same and remains in control and remains the one who dominates over the creation. And the creation is full of different changes. And so we find that in the Quran, those who believe and they go through trials and tribulations and adversity, they're described as those who remember that from Allah they come and to Allah they return. But in the same context overall, in this specific ayah, we find that the Quran teaches us that we will be tested with fear, we will be tested with hunger, we will be tested with deficiency in our wealth, we will be tested with death, and we will be tested in our resources, in our belongings, and the fruits of our labor. And then the Quran tells us, وَبَشِّرِ الصَّابِرِينَ, that those who have the ability to maintain in that trial and tribulation, good tidings come to them. Interestingly enough, we find that in the overall context of the number of, one surah we may study of surah, and then in that surah there's a general meaning. And then in that chapter of the Quran, or what we call surah, there's different groupings of ayat in each of the chapters. That is what we would consider the longer chapters of the Quran. So we find that a chapter of the Quran could be long or short, but in the longer chapters of the Quran, you're going to find that ayat are grouped. And in each grouping, you're going to find that each grouping is a number of ayat and they each have their own meaning or their own theme that they carry. And then you find that those themes within that chapter are interlinked, and then you find that there's an overall meaning to the chapter itself. And we know that Surah Al-Baqarah, one of the themes of Surah Al-Baqarah is the concept of guidance, the concepts of guidance overall. In Surah Al-Fatiha, or in the beginning chapter, we ask Allah for guidance, and in Surah Al-Baqarah, we find that we are given guidance and we're told what guidance is. And so one of the things that's interesting is that in the context of the grouping in which we find that the Quran describes those believers who go through trial and tribulation as those who say, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un, those who remember to say that from Allah we come and to Allah we return, that overall we find that it was mentioned is that the pillars of Islam become for us a training to allow us to deal with trial and tribulation. right? Those practices in Islam that we practice, such as prayer and giving charity and fasting and going to Hajj, that all of those acts of ibadah really support us in different ways to teach us how to deal economically, how to deal with charity, how to deal with the issue of justice, how to deal with the issue of connecting with Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, how to deal with self-discipline. There's a lot of different lessons that we can take from the pillars of Islam, but ultimately at the end of the day, those pillars, along with striving for the deen and sacrificing for the deen, the issue of striving and sacrificing and making effort is part of life. It's built into life that we have to strive and we have to struggle and we have to sacrifice. So the lesson that we get in this grouping is that the pillars of Islam are all there to educate us so that ultimately we have the ability to be able to function in the world when we are hit with trial and tribulation. When we are hit to trial and tribulation. But not only that, one of the things that's also embedded in meaning is that the believers have been exhorted to obey authority, to be just, to fulfill their pledges, to observe trees, to spend their wealth in the way of Allah. In other words, that there should be some internal organization as well as personal development and spiritual elevation. And that's how a nation and a community is built. That you have different exercises. In this case, we have the pillars of Islam that educate you on certain key values that will allow you to function in the ups and downs of life. And so it's not only limited to knowing how to function in the ups and downs of life. The Quran details that you have to remember in the times of trial and tribulation, what is your origin and where are you going and how do you deal with these struggles? Because it's only natural that trials and tribulations, adversity will cause us to be people that are disoriented, people that may be thrown into panic. So in that mode, how do you cope? And so the Quran is reminding us, that if we're struck with adversity, right? الَّذِينَ إِذَا أَصَابَتْهُمْ مُصِيبَةٌ قَالُوا إِنَّ لِلَّهِ وَإِنَّ إِلَيْهِ رَاجِعُونَ. Right? That those who they're struck with calamity, right? Their quality is that they say, from Allah we come and to Allah we return. And it allows us to get a sense of orientation. And you find that is the reality of the pillars of Islam. They give us an orientation in self-discipline, an orientation in economics, an orientation as far as the Qibla and the prayer is concerned, an orientation as far as organizing ourselves as an ummah, an orientation as far as remembering the struggles of the prophets that came before, all the way till we go to the time of the Prophet Adam and the Prophet Abraham. And we remember that there has always been these struggles of trying to make sense of what is the meaning of life, trying to make sense of how do we deal with suffering, trying to make sense of how do we have a life which allows us to preserve our values, to preserve what is truth, a life that allows us to go through the situations that we go through and get some sort of meaning from it. The alternative is to despair. The alternative is to despair. And there's an ayah in the Quran, وَمَنْ يَقْنَتُ مِنْ رَحْمَةِ رَبِّهِ إِلَّا الضَّالُونَ, that the only person that despairs from the mercy, right, of their Rabb. And despair here in the Quran is not a normal despair. It is a despair which is the highest degree of despair that the Quran is mentioning. That type of despair which causes you to collapse in your belief in anything that's good. That type of despair which leads you to possibly being suicidal, or possibly you just give up on life. You become a person that feels that everything is empty. That type of despair, the Quran mentions it as a despair that is not the way of the believers. It's a despair which it means that we don't have a connection with our Rabb. And it's interesting how the Quran here uses the term Rabb, and it doesn't use another term. It doesn't use the term Allah. It doesn't use the term Ar-Rahman. It doesn't use any other name or attribute of Allah, but it specifically says Rabb. So that we become aware that that's for all of humanity. That all of humanity at least should know that the Creator didn't just create us and just throw us to be tested. without any purpose, without any guidance, without any sense of love, without any sense of compassion. But actually the Creator created us, guides us in the process of creation, and then sends the Rusul to elevate us. And so trial and tribulation, when it comes, a lot of it has to do with with the meaning that we get out of it. It has to do with bringing out certain qualities in ourselves. You know, there's some trials and tribulations that come in the earth, and they come in the earth because of oppression. And in that case, the Quran enjoins us to establish justice. But there's some trials and tribulations that come to bring out qualities in human beings, and it is beyond our control, our hand, right? But we're taught how to orient ourselves so that we get a sense of discipline, a sense of direction, and we're not lost. And so either way, whether the trial and tribulation comes at the hands of human beings, or whether it comes in a way to purify and to reorient, what we're taught is that what comes from Allah is good. What we're taught in the Quran is that what comes from Allah is good. So at face value, we may see negatives in certain trials and tribulations, but what comes from Allah Ta'ala is good. Now, when it comes from the side of human beings and human beings being unjust to each other, even in that case, good may come out of it, but the Quran teaches us to establish what's right and what's wrong. What's right and what's wrong. But there are certain things that happen in the universe which are not explicable as to why they happen. You know, and then there's certain actions that come from human beings, and those actions that come from human beings teach us, yes, somebody faltered on establishing justice, or somebody established justice. In other words, human action can be determined right or wrong, right? And that's in the scale of the Quran. But what becomes more complicated is when, you know, things happen in life that is not necessarily due to human doing. That there now requires of us a sense of belief in which we trust in Allah Ta'ala. We trust that goodness will come, right? But in any event, whether we deem an act to be good or whether we deem an act to be wrong, at the end, if we have the right attitude with the right sense of orientation, we get a reward for it. And one of the things that we're reminded is that if we are plagued with a calamity, to learn how to say Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. This is an important principle to hold in mind, right? Because what it does is it gives us a very instantaneous understanding of the meaning of life. That we were created, we came into this world, and we go out of it. And we return back to Allah Ta'ala. But in the meantime, we come to account for what we have done. And for the wrongs that have been done to us, or for the suffering that we may have carried, and we may have been harmed by, what the promise of Allah is that there's a reward for that. That in the hereafter, there's a reward, that there's a sense of justice. And that is where Iman comes in at. Iman teaches us that this world is not the only world. That there's another world that comes after this. And if we're to consider the reality of what a lot of people are going through in today's time, right? If we were to consider the reality, a lot of us are really thinking about death. I think that is what this climate is making us do, is forcing us to think about death. Economy has been put on a pause. Human interaction is limited, right? Everything that we considered to be the normal for life has been disrupted. You know, everything as far as possibility, it seems to be restrained and constrained as far as what I want to do with my life, as far as what I have planned for tomorrow. And so the only thing that's left for us is to confront that reality of what is the meaning of life at the most profound level. Because we're confronted with not only what is the meaning of life, but what is the meaning of death. What is the meaning of death? And as we hear these stories that are around us, some of us may not be impacted, and we pray that we're not impacted directly, but we're impacted indirectly, and we can feel the vibe in the air. As we contemplate the meaning of death, that's where we have to reevaluate and see where our Iman is at. And see if we have some sort of connection with death itself. Death is a weighty lesson. It's a lesson in which it cuts off all hopes of the dunya. And what we're left with is strict dependency on the Creator. That what was promised to us is a promise that's true, that if we believe and we strive to the best of our ability, that we overcome death. And that is in part, I think, what causes a lot of distress to people, that in back of this is the issue of death. But the Quran is clear in the context of what we will be tested to bring out the best of our qualities with is with fear, is with hunger, is with deficiency in our wealth, and death itself, and deficiency in our resources, right? But then the Quran tells us with the follow-up with Bashir Sabirin, good tidings to those who are able to maintain in all that trial and tribulation, right? And they don't break down and lose it. That doesn't mean that we're not going to go through depression. That doesn't mean that we're not going to cry. That doesn't mean that we're not going to feel emotions, that we're not going to feel confusion. Anyone who has that mentality that thinks that Iman or your belief in Allah by itself is going to remove you from being human is mistaken. When we look at the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we find that even in the time of the Prophet and the companions, they asked, Mata Nasrullah, Allaah, Nasrullah Qareeb, right? And that was the tidings that were given to them when they asked, from when is the help of Allah coming? When will it come? Right? There was a state that we have to realize that was a profound cry. When will the help of Allah come? We've been suffering, we've been going through this and that, but we ask, when will the help of Allah come? Not in any disrespectful way to the Creator, but in a way which explicates what's deep in the human heart as far as what we go through when we suffer. You know, that we wish to come out of this, that we're looking for help, we're looking for aid, we're looking to be rescued. And then the Quran, it gives us that sense of tidings. Hold on, the help of Allah is near. And we see that there's no situation that remains the same on the earth. It's a constant flux between hardship and ease. And that's why in the context of this ayah, that those who are struck with calamity, they say, from Allah we come and to Allah we return. In the context, we're told that we're going to be tested, right, with all kinds of situations which strike at the core of our lives, with fear, with hunger, with loss of wealth, with death. Those are the things that shake the foundations of people and societies. And that's kind of what we're going through now. I said, but at the end of the day, what we're told is maintain. Orient yourself with Bashir Sabirin, right? And here, the issue of being patient is not just a patience which is passive. It is a patience which reorients itself. And here, in this context of loss, of tremendous loss, what we're being asked is to contemplate, to really reevaluate the meaning of life. The meaning of life and how you treat people. Here's the test for governments and for people in general, how they deal with people in this time of trial and tribulation. And we see that people, for some others, don't have any value. But in the midst of this, what we're taught is that in these times of trial and tribulation, whatever it was that we learned from the practice of the deen is supposed to be a training to help us to be able to orient. That doesn't mean that we're going to, keep it together in every instant. But what it does mean is that at least we have a reference point that we can come back to. And I want to emphasize that point, that as human beings, we tend to be frail and we tend to be disoriented, and that's okay. We find that those are situations that are very real. And the Quran itself, the way that it came historically, the way that it came to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was constantly a reassurance, as well as a group of teachings, that we find in the Quran. We find a group of consolations, right? So we find that the Quran consoled the Prophet because of those human situations. Situations in which you encounter, you're like, where's the support? You find, what is the meaning of this? I tried, I made effort. Why? This, that, all that type of questioning. And so we do need that consolation. We need to be consoled. And so the Quran comes and consoles us in this case in saying that, after these trials and tribulations, the fluxes of being tested with loss especially, a reward will come, good tidings, glad tidings to you. But you have to maintain. You have to maintain. And part of that maintaining is reorienting ourselves to understand what is our origin and the meaning of life. And that's going in itself going to take a test to be, suffered, or a test to be patient through, or a test to be lived through of self-examination. And really asking ourselves, where do we stand with this stuff? Where do we actually stand with belief in the hereafter? Where do we actually stand with the meaning of life? Where do we stand when we're tested in all of these dimensions? And what we're asked in the Quran is to be of those people that say, from Allah we come and to Allah we return. Like, what does that mean for me? Right? What does that mean for me? And that is a personal journey that everybody has to go through. There's no formula to give you in that regard. You have to self-examine yourself and see where you stand in that reality. And it's okay if you're like, whoa, I may not be okay with death right now. But the issue is, like, where are you at with regard to Allah? Because one of the qualities that we're told in the Quran that's not a quality of belief is shaddu yes, right? Shaddu yes is an extreme form of despair. That's not a quality of belief. That doesn't mean that we may not experience that as human beings, but it's not a quality of iman, because you don't get any reassurance from that. You don't get any security from that. Iman teaches us how to process with certain values, certain virtues, certain principles, certain beliefs that give us security. So in this time of trial and tribulation, what gives us a sense of security is believing that Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala has dominance in power. And Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala will bring good out of these situations. And that hardship is not forever, that it has its term. And that ultimately the biggest goodness that we can receive, or the biggest blessing that we can receive, or the biggest reward that we can receive, is to go out of this world with a sense of meaning and a sense of feeling secure in Allah, and open up to the hereafter. But while we're here in this world, we're taught to get meaning out of our trials and tribulations by orienting ourselves and by saying inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. From Allah we come and to Allah we return. It's not a statement that's just made when people die, but it's a statement of those who believe and how they respond to adversity. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر لي ولكم والحمد لله.